Every industry is being disrupted. Outdated patterns of work are slowing you down. Unimproved for years. To keep up, your enterprise needs to move faster. But what if you could structure and automate these patterns to accelerate the flow of work? With the ServiceNow System of Action, you can. The only cloud platform built for the entire enterprise, ServiceNow replaces the unstructured work patterns of the past with intelligent workflows of the future. This is your enterprise, transformed. Now any employee, customer, or connected device can easily make requests and get fast responses. Now teams working on these requests can assign and prioritize and collaborate. Get down to root cause issues and drive to action. IT can increase agility and lower costs by consolidating legacy tools into a modern, easy-to-use service management solution in the cloud. Security can collaborate with a team to resolve real threats fast, using a structured response engine to prioritize and resolve incidents based on service impact. Customer service can drive case volume down and customer loyalty up by accessing product service health in real time and working across departments to quickly remediate service issues. HR can consumerize the employee experience with self-service portals and get the insights they need to continually improve service delivery. And any department can quickly build business applications to automate processes with reusable components that help accelerate innovation. Now you can structure and automate the patterns of work, unleash productivity, deliver game-changing economics, and create an intelligent, connected enterprise. This is your business transformed. This is your enterprise.
I'm Nathan Wisnowski, Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. Concurrency is an organization of change agents. We make a difference, and we partner with businesses on the change that they need right now. Concurrency engages IT operations to build an efficient, capable cloud for the business. It also partners with the business in disruptive change to bring about new revenue and to bring about operational savings. We partner with businesses like Brunswick Corporation on a connected boat platform and migrating them to the cloud. We also partner with businesses like Clover Imaging that are doing AI-enabled distributed warehouses. We partner with businesses like Duff & Phelps that need to engage their customers with modern app platforms. And also engage customers like Rockwell Automation that are doing secure modern workplaces. Concurrency partners with organizations that need change agents and have change agents. We're here to help bring about change that drives new revenue and operational savings in your business. Let's work with each other today.
How's that? Good? Do I have? All right, there we are. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, hey, what a lively room. Well, welcome to the WTA February session. Really looking forward to this one. I'm going to give you a little intro for Sarah. Sarah Alt is the founder and CEO of the Ethical AI Consortium, nonprofit membership organization of industry partners, institutions of higher education, and professionals who are dedicated to the awareness of ethical and responsible use of advanced algorithms, analytics, automation, and artificial intelligence. I had to read that. That was so well written. I wasn't gonna, but the other thing is that Sarah is actually way on the forefront of this. She actually spoke for us in 2019, I believe we agree on, at our tech conference that we had out at Potawatomi. And from what I was told, unfortunately, I did not participate in your particular breakout, but the feedback that I got was fantastic. I'll come back and talk to you at the end of the session. But Sarah, welcome to the WTA. We're looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you to the WTA board and organization for continuing to focus on this topic, as Eric said, we've been talking about this for a couple of years. We've been doing a ton of research and getting ourselves sort of schooled up so that we can help organizations and help communities to address ethical AI. So yes, it felt like we were on the forefront of this 2 or 3 years ago, and sort of the future has happened, and today is going to be a great opportunity for me to update you if you did participate in that, update you on some of the latest sort of happenings and responsibilities that we may either now have or will soon have toward ethical and responsible AI. But then also for those of you that maybe this is your first time sort of getting exposure to this topic, we'll also kind of start from the ground up to make sure that everybody kind of understands how this may apply in their organizations. So again, thanks for having me and giving this some time, both here and in your headspace, I think, going forward. I'm not advancing slides, am I? What's happening? How did I lose connection? Oh, there we go. Okay, so we'll start out. We do have people on virtual participation, right? Are they able, I forgot to ask, are they able to chat in? Do we have somebody monitoring chat?
Okay. Chuck will keep an eye on it.
Chuck will keep an eye on it? Okay. All right, so does anybody recognize this symbol? Anybody know what this symbol is? If you're on the virtual participation, you see one head nodding in the room. If you're on virtual, feel free to chat in if you know what this is. Chuck, do we have anybody responding just yet?
Just saying good afternoon to everyone.
Okay, good. All right, I'll give you a few more seconds before I call on the one head that was nodding in the room. Get ready, Drew. All right, so Drew, you're on the spot, buddy. What is this symbol? Yeah, it's a hold or it's a pause. Some of you may recognize it a little bit more when I get the rest of the perspective and the picture up here for you. So if you're a musician, especially a musician who reads music, this symbol, also known as fermata, it signals a pause. It signals for you to hold just a little bit longer than what the note on the paper tells you to do. This is a quarter note. If you're with my piano teacher from when I was a young kid, she would tell you specifically you hold it about double what the amount was, and I'd say to her, well, why didn't they make it a half note then, right? Like a quarter note with it. And then sometimes you will get a hold, a signal to hold over a rest, which means you're silent, and they want you to be silent for a little bit longer, which always amused me because, again, most of the time what would happen is somebody thought your music was done and they would start applauding already if you had this stop in the middle of your music, whether you were done or not. And for me, I've had a few pause moments that have led me to ethical AI and led me to this stage with you today. 2 of them occurred in my own personal life. One was when we were sitting around the kitchen table and my son started talking to Alexa, and he didn't like what Alexa was saying, or she kept talking over us, and he told Alexa to shut up. So we don't talk like that in this house. We don't tell anybody to shut up. So you don't tell Alexa to shut up. And I realized for a brief moment that in our household, Alexa had sort of become the same type of person that we expected, and we expected to be treating Alexa the same way as we would an individual in the home. Shortly after that, Alexa asked my son, said, I don't recognize your voice. Have you heard this one yet from Alexa? I don't recognize your voice. What's your name? I said, oh, no, you don't. You don't need to tell Alexa your name. You're too young for that. So it was this moment where I realized that, of course, as a technology professional, I knew that these home systems and home smart systems and artificial intelligence could be listening all the time, but then I realized this has an impact beyond just me and me understanding this technology. And then the second event was right around the same time, I was about to post something on Facebook that was cute and funny that my daughter said. And she was 11 at the time, just about a year from when she was going to get her first phone, and I had already had in mind what the terms of her contract were going to be. And included in the terms of her contract were, do not post anything on Facebook about your friends that you haven't gotten their permission to do. So here I am posting something, and she goes, you're not posting that on Facebook, are you? Well, sure. It's something cute you said. I don't want you to do that. And I thought, wait a second. I'm going to be expecting her a year from now to follow the terms and the conditions of a contract that say what she can and cannot be posting on Facebook, and here I am not asking her for permission, just because what? I'm her parent and I get to make that decision. But I realized that this is going to mean something different for us and mean something different for our family. And so I took an indefinite pause on posting that specific type of content on Facebook. I didn't cancel Facebook altogether. I didn't leave Facebook. It's still here, and I still have friends on Facebook. But it was just that particular kind of content. So are we showing up here? OK, good. Yep. So probably the most significant event, though, for me that led me to where I am today occurred when I was in the workplace. Some of you have heard this story before. We had posted a position for a manager on our team, and we were working with our HR business partner, and she brought in the batch of resumes for us to review. And we just didn't find anything in there that sort of fit what we were looking for. So I said, let's get another batch of candidates. And so I fully expected that she was going to repost the position. Another 2 weeks would go by, and we'd have another batch of candidates. She came back 2 hours later with another batch of candidates. I said, well, where'd this group come from? She said, well, they were originally screened out. I said, well, screened out by whom? And she said, well, the system. OK, what system are we talking about? Well, the applicant tracking system. OK, well, we see some candidates in here that align a little bit more what we're looking for. So how do we know? How does the system know that it was wrong the first time when it's screened out? And again, remember, my definition of wrong was what I was seeing on paper, what I was expecting for this role. So back and forth this dialogue went, eventually included the vendor, because I felt this need for this to be explained to me. And so we involved the vendor, and the vendor said, couldn't really explain it themselves or weren't willing to explain it, because then we were sort of getting blocked by the whole, well, some of that is like how our software is built, and we can't really, disclose that and can't, break that down for you. So it was never really explained, and this was the really tough part for me, because my whole career was built as a technologist on this idea that I could explain it to my either internal or external customers. And it was frustrating to me, but it was also like an existential moment of who are we if we can't explain how this technology works? And this was before we were really even talking about AI in the workforce. This was an analytic, an advanced analytic that was built into the software, and we weren't really referring to it as AI back then. So definitely the types of moments that brought me to where I knew that we would face these dilemmas more and these questions more from our colleagues and our workforce and our communities and in our personal lives. And we all know that AI can do some really awesome things for the world. So this also isn't about canceling AI. It's not about stifling innovation. But it is about making sure that we understand our responsibilities, the ethics, and the trustworthiness as we build it. So great things that we can do with AI. And there's also some pretty significant ways in which AI can go awry, or has gone awry. The latest of these, or most recent of these headlines here, is at the bottom left of your screen. In July of 2020, IBM decided to halt all facial recognition development in the face of some scrutiny and some public perception and reality about how facial recognition was being used in law enforcement. and the bias and discrimination that was not intended by IBM, but in the way that that technology was being used by the law enforcement agencies, the way that the type of data that was being processed and pushed into the engine, and then the recommendations that it was making, the output, was enough to cause the big names, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and IBM, to at least call a pause, whether that be a momentary pause, or in the case of IBM, at least at that time, saying they would halt, so an indefinite pause on facial recognition. Now, the interesting history behind this one, I don't know if you know this, but in 2019, IBM had a little bit of a problem when they scraped hundreds of thousands of Flickr images from Creative Commons sources to train facial recognition. Now, I don't know if the two are connected, correlated, you know, that the training mechanism that they used from the Flickr images without people's consent, without the photographer's consent that were posting them, and without the people's consent to use those images. So I don't know if the two are related. But again, both occurring within 18 months for IBM. So they halted that. So this actually brings up an interesting question about just how, you know, prevalent these, you know, technologies are, and what the possibility is out there of combining, you know, data sources and otherwise free images and free data to create some of this AI. So let's talk a little bit about how big this is, or how, you know, how wide it is. The global AI software market is projected to be, by 2025, about 126 billion or more. Now, this is interesting because you also have to understand, we have to understand how we define what AI software is, right? Similarly, 70% of companies may have adopted at least one type of AI technology by what's the year on that? 2030, thank you. Now, to be clear, the 5 categories that these, are we locked? Pausing. Enjoy my screensaver. Feel like I'm going to have to come back and do this, right? Hold on. We're just going to disable that guy. Give us a second, please. Talk amongst yourselves. Never. Okay, are we back? Let's hope that screensaver doesn't go back on. Okay. Back. Okay, 5 categories that these first 2 stats include: computer vision, natural language, virtual assistants, robotic process automation, and advanced machine learning. Okay, so as you think about these first 2 statistics, think about those 5 categories. Some of you may already have some of these in your workplaces today. Computer vision, natural language, virtual assistants, robotic process automation, or advanced machine learning. Does that sound familiar? Any of those in your organizations? I see some hands. Yep. Okay. So those numbers probably aren't that far off when you think about in terms of, now it also, like I said, depends on how you define artificial intelligence, because we take a broader view of this and we say any advanced automation, any advanced analytics, you know, any advanced algorithmic science that you have. When you do that, and when you think about that, it's a bigger group. 67% of customers said they expect a company to take ownership of their AI algorithms, according to a Capgemini study. 67%. My attorneys always remind me you can expect whatever you want, right? But it just depends on what you can hold them legally accountable for, which is another trick that we have when we talk about ethical AI, is what can you hold organizations legally accountable for? And the number one place of sort of, yes, we all know computing power and speed has is so much faster than it used to be, and the access to technology is much easier. But data and the explosion of data is certainly what feeds and what's the fuel for AI. And you need data to be able to do that. You need processing, storage power, I get all that too. But you need data because you need the correlations, you need the science, you need all that, the analytics to work. So the World Economic Forum predicts that by 2025, 463 exabytes of data will be created every single day. It's a lot of data. So what we think about are the most important question, and we were asking this back in the 2019 event. We've been asking it since the beginning. Frankly, we've probably been asking this question when any technology advancement came along. I'm sure somebody said, just because we could put a television in every home, does that mean we should? Right? Just because we could put a phone in everybody's hands, does that mean we should? So this isn't like a new question, okay? But that doesn't mean that it is any less important or that we should be any more irresponsible with making sure that we are doing the right thing, even if the law allows us to do it. That's the key here. Even if it's legal, because we are talking about, for the most part, other than data privacy and other than your typical product safety areas, artificial intelligence really is largely unregulated. We're starting to see that change, which I'll tell you more about a little bit later. But it still has, up to this point, been largely unregulated. So it's not, even if the law allows us to do it, the question is, should we do it, or should we do it that way? That's the other thing, is there are potentially different ways that we could be safer or more responsible with people's data or with the artificial intelligence. The whole idea of just because 463 exabytes of data will be available every day doesn't mean that we necessarily have to consume it or use it or analyze it or turn it into an AI. Okay, so if you have your mobile devices, for those in the room, for those virtual, you can do this on a mobile device or on a browser. If you have your machine in the room, you can also do it on a browser. And I realize that I'm with a bunch of technology professionals who are probably like, I'm not going to share my phone number with anybody. I get it. Participate if you'd like. I will not force you. But I'd like to hear from you. Which of the following best describes your organization's capability and maturity to identify trustworthy and ethical AI? So this is your feeling of your organization's capability and maturity in this space. I'll give you a few seconds to respond. Hopefully it's working. Oh, there we go. I'm going to just get my water. I forgot to bring that up. Okay. So we're mostly, my mic's not picking up yet. Thank you. All right, so we're mostly at a basic understanding, a little bit of a desire to or need to, and a recognition of being proactive about it, so that's good. So many of you maybe are just starting some of those discussions. You may be in a role where you can influence some of that. And so one of the points that we want to make sure that we understand is that, like I said earlier, even if you aren't breaking laws, because they might not even exist yet, we want you to be aware of the reputational harm, the reputational risk that can go along with making mistakes here. And many of the mistakes that I showed you on that prior slide were made by really, really big brands, that can also potentially afford the reputational risk, because there are ways in which they can compensate for that. And some of our organizations maybe don't have the wherewithal to do that. But the impact can be just as great. Okay, so the rest of what we're going to do during the session is kind of divide this into two parts. So the subtitle of our session was, where do we start? And often we like to start with debunking the myths first. And I know enough about this crowd that the myths that I'm going to present to you, I probably am not trying to convince you or debunk these myths for you. You probably get this. It's your audiences inside of your organizations. It might be your clients, might be your customers, your leadership teams, that perhaps don't understand and haven't had these myths debunked for them yet. So I want you to look at it from both lenses, which is, do I get this myth already? And do I understand this is a myth? And do I understand myself? And then how might I explain this to others? Or do I have people around me that perhaps need this myth debunked? So first place you might need to start, depending upon where you are on that maturity curve, is debunking the myths in your workplace. First one that we still have to clear up for everybody is this myth that, because when I ask IT leaders as an example, do you have any AI in the workplace? Nope, not yet, is usually the answer that I get. Because in most cases, human beings are thinking robots are AI. So unless I have robots, I don't have AI. So I'm good, right? Do you have advanced analytics? Do you have advanced automation? Do you have algorithms that are making recommendations, predictions, decisions? Oh yeah, we got those. Okay, then you pretty much have AI. You have the components, fundamental, and do you have access to a lot of data? That's the other thing, right? So you have these components that are kind of already fundamentally existing that make up AI, even without robots sitting next to you. And that's an important myth to debunk, because what often will happen is, where we see more of that physical representation that we often associate with AI is more likely going to happen in those areas where you already have advanced analytics, advanced automation, advanced algorithmic decision making. Because that's just how naturally we know technology progresses. So don't ignore it just because you don't have robots. A professor at Harvard Law School had a great analogy where he referred to it sort of like referred to machine learning sort of as like asbestos. And his fear was that for the long time we were putting asbestos in because we thought that was the right thing to do. And then eventually we learned that that's not really a good thing. And so now it's in like all of these places that we have to go eradicate it, or make sure that we don't, or make sure that we know where it is so that we're responsible for it. His point was that's a lot like what machine learning has been over the years. My example about the applicant tracking system was from 7 years ago. So even if we regulate AI or we put in guardrails now, we've had this stuff in place for some time. And we've had people trusting the predictions and the decisions, and or not asking the questions that I was asking about the system for some time. So that's a really important first myth that we have to debunk. And one of the places that we get most of the data from when we're talking about all this data is from social media. So if you or your organization are pulling mountains of this, both unstructured but also one of the most highly unregulated sources of data, social media, even though it's free and available, we have to make sure that we understand how we're responsibly using it. And again, we'll talk a little bit about intent a little bit later, but you may not be using it in a way that you're intending to cause harm or intending to cause bias or discrimination, but it could, even if you weren't intending. So the next myth, this one's my favorite because this is usually a CFO or a CEO in our lives that is wondering, wait, why do we have to keep going back and tuning this thing? Why do we have to keep going back and looking at it again? I paid a lot of money for it, so can't we just set it and forget it? Set this technology in place, let it ride, let it roll, and we're good, right? And we know that as technologists that's just not how the market works. Even forget about AI. We've known that, with the advent of all of our cloud-based software and technologies and mobile apps that we update on a regular basis. And what we're looking for in ethical AI is that we do the same or substantially similar practice of making sure that the algorithms are updated. And it's kind of like this updating for a couple reasons. One is because as your data gets cleaner, as you identify your data better, as you go through the situation that I did with the applicant tracking system and you say, you got it wrong, system, the first time, we found a candidate in the second batch. I did not have confidence that the system would know that our second batch of candidates that you had already screened out was actually where we found the candidate that we brought on board. And oh, by the way, it is not lost on me that perhaps this technology was intended to be less biased than the human. And is it possible that maybe I had a certain view of my own, of the ideal candidate? And so this is the complexity that we have to deal with when we're talking about, unconscious and implicit bias as humans, and what that means for the promises of technology to be able to help us with that. So the first one, like I said, is making sure that we're tuning the algorithm for the application or for the use or for the culture. And then the second one is also tuning it for and understanding how the algorithm changes over time, because cultural norms change over time. I think we all know what we were doing in the workplace, in the 50s and 60s is not appropriate for the workplace anymore. What we were doing 9 years ago in the workplace is not appropriate anymore, potentially. So the same thing happens with our software, and then therefore with our algorithms or with the AI that's built in, is we also have to adjust them for the situation. We have to adjust them for changes in expectations, changes in culture, and so on. So it's not a set it and forget it science. There we go. Back in 2018, 2019, if you were with us, we spent that breakout time introducing you to the 7 guidelines that are on the right on your screen from the EU Commission. The EU Commission is the same organization that you can thank for bringing the world GDPR. If you don't know, most of us all know what GDPR is. Some of us have the scars to prove what GDPR is, right? And all the work that we've had to do for that. So the European Commission, upon its what is still declared as to be a successful, global standard for data privacy. In fact, CCPA, Brazil's data privacy law, like lots of countries and governments and states are looking at GDPR as their model for data privacy. So then the EU Commission set their sights on giving guidelines to the world around ethical or trustworthy AI. As recent as December of 2020, then President Trump signed Executive Order 13960. Thus far, it has not been overturned that we have seen. And in that order, you can see they've listed guidelines, principles they call them, but essentially you could call them guidelines too. 9 principles for designing, developing, acquiring, and using AI. Now, let me tell you a little bit about an executive order. First of all, it can be overturned by the next administration, the administration we have now. This particular executive order only applies to federal agencies or those that serve them. okay? That's the order that serves them is very interesting. Because if you have a government contract, you may be affected by these expectations and these principles. Also, who else has government contracts? Big software companies that we know of, many of them that we probably buy or subscribe to. So your Googles, your Amazons, your Microsofts, your IBMs, et cetera. So this is the sort of the executive order that's at least setting the tone and setting the signal for where we may be headed. And this, like I said, just came out in December of 2020. Now, what it does is it says that within 120 days, federal agencies have to identify and have to have inventoried where they're using AI in any of these. And they're quite broad here because it says designing, developing, acquiring, and using. So this is not just an accountability to the development side of this ecosystem or of the supply chain. This is also on the all the way through to the using side. So the subscribers and the buyer side. So 120 days or 180 days, you have to have identified it. Then you have to put an action plan in place. So this is basically setting the tone for what's supposed to happen in 2021, at least for federal agencies. And so our guidance as the EAIC is that if this is not on your radar yet, like if this isn't on your 3-year strategic plan, that you may need to be doing something here depending upon what sector you're in, depending upon what industries you're in, it probably should be. And again, you don't need to wait until it's law or you're required to, because we have some approaches that you can put in place a little bit later. We'll talk about that. Yeah.
So the 9 principles, so if you go and look up the 13960,
Yeah.
all those 9, are there definitions for each one of those?
Yes.
And who
Ish.
Ish?
Yeah. They're not really well defined because here's what's happening. Thank you for that question. For those that didn't hear, what Eric asked is if you go out and look up 13960, will you see these things defined? There's a few sentences in there that tell you what that is. But what the executive order also does is it taps NIST. Do you all know who NIST is? Right? Many of us know NIST from certifications and otherwise. It's tapping the NIST and IEEE to basically give that guidance. So they'll give us even more definition. They'll give us more framework. In some cases, standards, maybe certifications. I think we can expect we'll see that. But right now, it's pretty light, which is why we still use the EU Commission because it's very clear that the rest of the world, if they're doing anything, Singapore's doing it, Hong Kong's doing it, Canada's doing it. The rest of the world has used the EU Commission as their guide. And you could easily do the draw the lines, and you can see where these are very similar. So if you are looking for something that's much more, that gives you the answers that Eric's looking for, defines it, tells you how to get there, the EU Commission standard is well on that path. And it doesn't harm you to start there because if anything, you'll be ahead of the game and ahead of the work over here. Question, yep.
Who's enforcing this?
Who's enforcing the left side? Any of it?
Any of it. EU or US?
Yeah. With the exception of, the typical software is fit for purpose and product safety guidelines and then following data privacy and protection laws. There's some new laws on the books around in Illinois for you can't use video, or you have to disclose when you're using video in interviews. We've got this patchwork quilt of laws. But as far as these guidelines are concerned, they are still just that in the EU. And as far as these principles in the executive order, it's really up to the interpretation of the federal agencies on how, to the letter of the executive order, they decide to follow it. So it's not really beyond an executive order at this point, and beyond whatever state laws we have, because we do not have federal laws around data privacy. We have state laws right now. The last I heard, the last I researched, and I double-checked it just before I got here, there is AI Accountability Act being proposed in Congress. It was proposed in 2019. It didn't even get heard on the floor, but they're hoping that in 2021 they'll get more traction. So that's going to be one to keep your eyes on that may get reintroduced, and you're going to see this sort of how do we enforce the stuff on the left kind of stuff. Now, one more exception, which thank goodness, I don't think we should be surprised by this. The FDA has just also announced in January, the FDA just announced their first 5 actions that they're taking for AI and machine learning based software as a medical device. So we're starting to see sectors say, hold on, we've got life-threatening situations where AI and machine learning are being used. We better start regulating and putting some regulations in place. And that's certainly one of them. Autonomous vehicles is another one. Once again, you'd expect that. Thank goodness we're talking about human life and protection there. Autonomous weaponry, another one. But these are big. I mean, as I look across the room, I'm pretty sure you're not working on autonomous vehicles, autonomous weaponry. You might be working on medical device, though, right? So yeah, it's a patchwork quilt of having to keep track of this. But we believe that these principles, for the most part, are going to hold. It's just a question of, are they going to hold in terms of laws, regulations, guidelines, standards? Like, how are these going to emerge, right? And it could be any of those combinations. But your typical acronyms, your typical acronym soup of standards bodies are all working on this. IEEE, ISO. We already talked about NIST. So I think we can expect that we'll see that firming up in the next 2 years. So really, we talk data privacy and protection, or where we have laws. It's obviously a good place to start because we have to, but it's not enough. It's not enough reputation-wise. It's not enough depending upon where you are and how your organization serves and treats fundamental human rights. So, the message here is we don't necessarily need to wait for those regulations to be in place, or we don't need to wait for somebody to tell us whether it's law or not. What is our version of just doing the right thing here? Okay, the next myth is my vendor or supplier is responsible for making for the mistakes we make with AI. This one kind of goes along with I paid a ton for it, paid a lot of money for it, so it's good, right? It's high quality, it's fit for purpose. So they're responsible if I make a mistake with it. You could get away with that for like the first year when this was all kind of coming to market. You really can't anymore. Now, obviously, if you find that a vendor or supplier with intent built something that was intentionally biased or intentionally discriminatory in the whole deal, we're back to they just did not build a quality product, okay? They're responsible for building the quality product, make sure it's fit for purpose. New regulations, like I said, are still being proposed to make sure that that happens. But it's more complex than that, than just saying they're responsible for it. Now, if we were in a big whiteboard, I would be drawing a whiteboard, so bear with me. This is my version of a whiteboard drawing. So here's the complexity in this whole idea that, we can just hold our vendor and supplier accountable. We've got humans still involved in this transaction, and all of the humans, regardless of what role you're playing, we all have our own cognitive processes that we make our decisions based upon. We also have, in our hearts and our guts, these values, these beliefs, our intuition, whatever our drives are, and the culture and the norms that we were raised in and or were that developed and matured and emerged over time. Likewise, in the market, we have sellers who have motives, and they have their own culture and norms that they bring to that. Now, I want to pause here because motives often are viewed as something negative. Like whenever somebody brings that up, what's your motive, right? Because it must be bad. Well, no, my motive is good in many cases. The software seller for our applicant tracking software, they had a positive motive. We will make this easier for you to process all those applicants and make it easier for you to identify the candidates that are most likely to succeed in the role. Likewise, the buyer in that situation was probably somebody, in HR, probably the head of HR, might have been the VP or Chief Human Resources Officer. And again, she had her motives and her culture and her norms by which she was going into that transaction. The user in this case was my HR business partner. She also had her motives and her norms and so on. And somewhere in there were the beneficiaries. Now, I was a beneficiary as a hiring manager because she was bringing that data to me. Likewise, the candidates, technically, that decision was being based upon their data, so they're a beneficiary in that process as well. So we've got all of these humans with all of these cognitive processes and their values and their belief system that is brought together whenever we're talking about AI like this. Can we move my video screen off the top right there? And then, thank you. And then here's the interesting question that we have to ask when AI is concerned. Is it required that this AI be used on me versus is it just convenient? Because all of these people on the left there are combining all of their decision-making processes in how they're designing, how they're building, how they're using, how they're buying, on whom, bless you, they're using the AI. And lots of times it's just for convenience, right? Think about the algorithms that recommend what others like you bought on Amazon or movies that somebody else like you watched, right? Like, okay, if you don't like it or if you're offended by it or whatever, the view of those algorithmic owners and designers is, well, then just don't use it. Ignore it, right? Sometimes it still might be offensive, but again, in their view, we gave you that algorithm for convenience. Oppression through algorithmic bias is a real thing when you haven't given people a choice, but for the algorithm to be used on them. So when we think, later we'll talk about prioritizing, where you need to look, meaning where you need to go fix some things, where you may need to act. Certainly anywhere where people don't know the algorithm is being used, where it's required and or it's a black box or it's somehow they're not aware. What those principles have already emerged to say is that you may be required to notify. We already are required in Illinois to notify that you're using video. You're required to give certain rights that you're using video in interviews, and more to come. Okay? The most important thing to remember is it's your data, your process, and your people in those scenarios. So in any of those situations where you're looking at these different roles and you're trying to figure out who's accountable, we have to remember that the technology itself may be great. It may be fit for purpose. It may be high quality. The facial recognition technology that was used by law enforcement agencies was believed to have been high quality. But what happened is that the agencies that were subscribed to that technology or bought that technology already had data that was biased and discriminatory. They had not ruled out the possibility that their own data, when they would then put it into the system, might amplify that bias. So IBM and others said, okay, our bad. I tell the kids on my basketball team, when you make a mistake, just say my bad, right? Own it. My bad. What some of those principles are asking us potentially to do, expect of us to do, is put the version of warning labels on this to say, you can't use this unless you've been properly trained. If your data is already biased, if you garbage in, garbage out, as long as they're going to hold people developers accountable to make sure that their systems don't amplify bias, but they can't control your data. They're not in control of that. There's a clear line of separation if you look in your terms and conditions in your contracts, right? You wouldn't want them, in some cases, to have access to your data. Okay, so this is a really important concept to start working into our dialogue when we're, considering, when we're looking at RFPs, when we're looking at our vendors and suppliers relationships, and when we're looking at the terms and conditions to make sure that we're constantly tuning and understanding how that changes in an artificial intelligence model. Okay, the last one is the myth that AI will replace all humans in the workplace. And I get that. This one, I think people are starting to feel a little bit better about this than they originally were. Some people, maybe not, are still on this sort of fearful end. What we see, and some of you may recognize this material as well. If you're familiar with Pendio Group, Todd McLeese with Pendio Group, he's given us permission to use this to remind us that what we're looking forward to more in this space is the upskilling and the cross-skilling and the opportunities that AI will bring to the workplace. Yes, there's robotic process automation that's going to automate some tasks and automate some things that we perhaps had people doing before. And if we're doing it right and responsibly, we're opening up new opportunities for that workforce. The EU Commission standard and the one that's being proposed by the senators that they're planning to reintroduce in 2021 asks that and expects that where you're putting in advanced automation, you can demonstrate and show that you had a cross-skilling or upskilling opportunity to give that workforce. I don't know if that will hold in all cases, but again, do you have to be told or regulated that should hold, or do you want to do the right thing for people? That's what we have to decide, right? Menial, manual, and dangerous tasks in most manufacturing settings are disproportionately held by minority populations. Those jobs, manual labor, menial tasks, dangerous jobs being held by minorities. And so this is why the EEOC, FTC, and others are all wanting to make sure that we have at least accounted for and understood that AI may not replace all humans, but then we also have to make sure that we have a place for those humans that we do find ways to automate their jobs. And we can do that in so many ways, so many skills that we need to be working alongside AI. So many skills to do the kinds of things and to have the critical thinking that we're practicing here as we think about the effect that AI has on us. So this is often, let me double check where we are. Yeah, okay. So this is often where I get into a debate, a healthy debate with people who say, if there's enough money and people willing to pay data scientists and software engineers to do nefarious things, people are going to just do it. They're just going to take the money and they're going to build, bad AI and stuff that is going to steal and do bad things. I'm actually not as concerned about those situations because we can prosecute for intent. I am pretty certain, thus far, it is not proven out that the AI that caused the facial recognition problems for law enforcement agencies, that anybody in IBM intentionally said, go build, Eric, an AI that is going to discriminate. That wasn't their plan, right? Or when when Amazon had its hiring algorithmic bias go awry and it was screening out female candidates. Again, nobody found intent there. Nobody found that somebody said, I want you to build an AI algorithm that screens out all the female candidates. If they had, that would be a different conversation. What we're more concerned about is the situations where it's unintended, where it was a combination of something and I didn't know what it was going to do. Where it's an unconscious bias or an implicit bias, or it's an unawareness of the impact. Because those are harder for us to like point out and punish people for, frankly, but the damage is the same. Damage has already been done. So I get it. I understand this whole idea of, well, if people are willing to pay for it, people are going to do bad things. Yep, I get that. And we're also concerned about the situations where it may have been unintended, where we believed that we were doing the right thing. But again, it didn't necessarily turn out that way. Okay, so let's take another poll here. I'd like to hear actually two things. Respond to the poll, certainly. Let us know which one of these do you feel the greatest need to debunk for your organization. And then while you're doing that, I'm also curious, both from the room and the virtual crowd, what other myths have you had to debunk about AI? Either because you yourself have had to, or that you wish somebody would debunk because it's problematic, or you think it's the wrong message. Curious, any others, or Chuck, see if anybody's chatting in too, please. Any others that conversations about AI that you've gotten into? Nobody?
Yeah, so I mean,
Brent?
there's one. So there's this thing that computers can't lie. If you think about it.
It's a good one, Brent.
So if you think about people doing gaming.
Yeah.
You think about chess, checkers, Go, etc. And poker. And poker is basically bluffing lying. You're essentially teaching them to lie. I think you're trying to teach them to lie.
Right.
So there's probably lying implications and things like that as
Right.
well.
Yeah, so Brent Leland, thank you. The myth that he mentioned that he also has to debunk, which I think is a great one, we may add it, thank you for that. This whole myth that, well, the computer must be right, because it's a computer, right? Which then again goes back to the whole, I'm pretty sure in that applicant tracking system situation, neither of us was dumb. It's not like we're not smart people. We just trusted all this time that the software was right. And rightness is defined by whatever rules and measures and ones and zeros that still humans are programming to say is right. And that's an important concept. There's a video out there that really drives home this idea of certainty in algorithms and certainty in AI. And because we have this expectation that it be certain, when it goes rogue or when it goes awry is usually because it understands the computer is supposed to do what's programmed to be right and be more and more right every single time. That can get a little bit out of control if you haven't properly defined that guardrail for what is right. And it will just keep getting more and more right, which could actually be more and more wrong. Any others? Did anybody chat? Any in? Okay, I hope you're all out there.
They just want your slide deck.
Oh, I have to say please. Okay. All right, so let's move on to this second half. Thank you for that. Looks like number 3, my vendor supplier is responsible for the mistakes made. Yeah. I will say that this regulation that is potentially being proposed is going to put more on vendors than suppliers. So if you happen to be one in the room, sorry, not sorry. But I do see that they're starting with the places where we can expect the most funding should be, and the dollars can be dedicated to fixing this. But again, the law will, and attorneys will remind us that it will only go so far in terms of holding the vendor or supplier accountable, especially if it's your people, your process, and your data that it's being used with. Okay, so, again, the subtitle was Where Do We Start? Debunking the myths may be a good place to start for you. The next things that we can work through, you might be in different stages of this. These are just suggestions of, they're not necessarily meant to be taken in order. You may start in the middle. You may not even be ready to start any of these. Let's talk. We'll figure that all out depending upon the situation that you're in. But these are some examples of guidance that we're giving. The first thing that we like to do is make sure that we're prioritizing, because if I told you to go look for all the places where algorithms are being used in your organization, it just wouldn't be, it'd be burdensome, but it also wouldn't be practical. Because they're not all situations where we have the greatest concerns about the impact to, again, bias or discrimination or improper use or safety issues or anything like that. So not all of them will apply. Both the EU Commission and the US guidelines are suggesting that the places where we must prioritize, like high risk, they're calling these high risk areas for AI, are autonomous vehicles and weaponry, because again, they're life-threatening situations. So number one is anywhere where there's life-threatening situations, and those two categories always bubble to the top for life-threatening. The second one is anywhere where biometrics is being used. So that's face, voice, fingerprints, what else am I missing? DNA and retina. And then of course any other biometrics that have, even the contact tracing for COVID has come under scrutiny as a biometric because of just how it identifies who you are or a characteristic about you. So second one was biometrics. The third one, so some of you in the room are like, sweet, we're good, because we're not in that area. We're not in that area either. Sorry, number three probably applies to all of you. And that is in any situation where you're using data or AI for employment or for workers' rights, anything that has to do with keeping people employed, how they're paid, their performance, anything related to employee relations, which we all have, pretty much all of us have in our organizations. So if I were to leave you with where to prioritize, then, therefore, if you don't fit any of those other two major categories, definitely reach across to your HR business partners and or your colleagues in HR and say, hey, what do you say we just take a closer look at the systems that are guiding our decisions the whole way through in HCM or HRS or whatever acronym we're using these days to cover the whole life cycle of the employee, of the worker. And we also want you to engage your diversity, equity, inclusion people, and not just because they're in HR, because of priority number 3, but also because you know what it was like to ask for a seat at the table when it comes to innovation in your organizations. Many of us struggled through that mightily in the last several years. So if you're building IoT into products, if you're building AI or advanced analytics into your business models, bring your diversity, equity, inclusion people to the table, because they are just as important to the products and services and to your brand as they are to internally the diversity, equity, inclusion that you have. Now they may look at you sideways and go, I've never been asked to contribute diversity, equity, inclusion, leadership and thought leadership and awareness to products and services. And that's when you say, no problem, we'll figure this out as we go. But we need you there because we do not want to make a mistake with our products and services. The next one is then once you've prioritized, and this goes back to the whole myth of, well, I don't have robots there, so I'm good. No. Go ask, where do we have, within the priorities, start with HR, where do we have algorithms, analytics, automation, or AI in anything that we're doing? You might only shuffle out like 4 places. Super. Focus on those 4. But you might shuffle out some more. It might surprise you. And again, you know, if all you're doing is just creating your inventory right now, you're ahead of the game. Okay, first 120 days if you're a federal agency is to do just that, create your inventory. While the other guidance we give here is you're probably under the hood for HIPAA and PII and GDPR related stuff in your audits anyways, your information security audits and all these other ones. So just add this to it, because you probably are looking in the same places. So educate your workforce on what they're supposed to be looking for when it comes to the 4 A's, and give it identity in those audits, give it identity in your inventories. The next thing is, again, you can start here, right? This isn't about stepwise process, but another place to look is at defining and understanding what explainability and transparency is going to mean to us as a culture. Go back to that whiteboard exercise of how does our organization value being transparent, and how do we improve our explainability here? You can say just internally to the organization, and depending upon what role you play in the marketplace, you maybe need to have a clinical discussion about what does being explainable and transparent mean externally as well. Because once you have your priorities, once you've identified where this stuff is, you may need to explain it. All I needed was somebody from HR to just explain to me how that system made its decision. It wasn't even an external explanation, it was just internally to me. Okay? So it wasn't that she wasn't being transparent in that case, she just didn't know. You know, and had never been asked before. I've used this example before, and it still is very relevant. If you're looking for an organization that has nothing to do with AI, but that is really good, well, maybe they have something to do with AI, but their product has nothing to do with AI, but does a really good job of explainability and transparency, it's SC Johnson. And I get no, promotional credit for this at all. But go out to their website and look at what SCJ does with transparency. And I always use this example because I'm one of those where I like to look at examples around the world of what's worked and then figure out, okay, well that seemed to work. So now how can we apply that to being more transparent about AI? And if you know anything about SCJ, it's chemicals, right? It's chemicals, products. They were probably forced somewhere by some country to have to be more transparent and list the ingredients. And I get that. And the way that they've done that and the way that they communicate it is really well done. So that might be a place to just, kind of divorce yourself from AI and just go look at how they tackle transparency and see if that cultural value kind of can translate a little bit into what would it mean if we were going to tell people more about how the algorithm works, a little bit about the ingredients inside of these algorithms. Another one for us to do is, and depending upon how much governance you have to do in your organizations around information security, again, data privacy or anything else, would be, again, to clinically include it in your governance practice. Because once you do go through an inventory as an example, and you have prioritized and you have an understanding of where it is, when we go back to this idea of tuning the algorithm, making sure that it's still fit for purpose, making sure that the cultural norms are still fit for what it was intended, you need to have responsibility for doing that. And somebody needs to not forget to go do that and tune it and make sure that it's still being used appropriately. So include it in your governance. By the way, there is a movement for, in GDPR as an example, there's a provision for designing for privacy, this expectation that, that EU citizens have, that you've designed for privacy and protection of their data instead of having to ask for it. Here in the US, we have to ask you to be private with my data. We have to ask you to not use it. In the EU citizens, it's given. That right is given to you to have it private and protected. So what they're also pushing for is that ethics by design, just like privacy by design, is going to be the new principle. I don't know if that will translate here to the US, because as we saw with GDPR, it did not, or with CCPA, it did not. This opt-in versus opt-out thing still seems to be different in the cultures. In Europe, I have to opt out to say you can use my data. It's the reverse here. So I don't know if that will be the same, but designing for ethics, designing for responsibility, designing for trustworthiness might be another thing to include in our governance practices as well. And then once you've identified where you're looking, if you have concerns, if you're starting to see the principles turn into regulations or guidelines or anything else, you're going to have to act. You're going to have to determine, what does acting look like to you? Is it something that is in your control to act? Is it something that you're going to enforce on your vendors or suppliers to act? But certainly expect the same from them as well. There's a really good guide out there from the World Economic Forum. It's basically a buyer's guide for government agencies that are buying or subscribing to ethical AI. And even if you're not a government agency, you could easily, again, back to my concept of take a model and apply it. It's written for government agencies for a reason, because that's how the World Economic Forum works. The intention is then to influence within the government and then therefore influence into the private sector. So if you had this guide, this buyer's guide, and you sort of reframed that for what does it look like to be a company buying an AI from another company, you could use and sort of formulate the same guide for yourselves. And what it does is it gives you a list of the questions and the expectations you should have of your AI vendors and suppliers in terms of what you expect of the product and how you're going to use it. So it's a good place to look. All right, so that's at least 5 places different places you can start, depending upon where you are in the journey. Okay, the last thing before we just open it up to discussion. Northwestern Mutual recently partnered with area universities and with the Milwaukee Film Festival to make available to our community a really important film that has a lot to do with and speaks a lot to some of the things that we've already talked about, but that are also broader issues around ethical and responsible AI. So we're very fortunate to have this available. It's available to high school students, college students, and educators for free to watch, and substantially nearly free for $3.99 for anybody else. So very much worth your time and small amount of dollars to watch. I'm just going to play for you the trailer. We're good, Chuck, right?
During my first semester at MIT, I got computer vision software that was supposed to track my face. It didn't work until I put on this white mask I'm thinking, all right, what's going on here? Is it the lighting conditions? Is it the angle at which I'm looking at the camera, or is there something more? That's when I started looking into issues of bias that can creep into technology.
Our ideas about technology that we think are normal are actually ideas that come from a very small and homogeneous group of people.
Vast amounts of data at incredible speeds.
Everybody has unconscious biases, and people embed their own biases into technology.
This kid got stopped as a result of facial recognition misidentification, and then used that as justification to search you. This is an innocent child.
Racism is becoming mechanized.
Systemic issues are only going to be hardwired into new technologies.
It's not just face classification, it's any data-centric technology.
Every day, we are all being scored.
Who gets hired? Who gets housing?
I am making predictions for your life right now.
The people who own the code deploy it on other people, and there is no accountability.
Management analytic towers wanted to install the facial recognition software. Pretty much turn this place into Fort Knox.
The technology is being rapidly adopted, and there are no safeguards.
We are socially controlled in a way that we don't see.
Technology that analyzes faces could be biased, but the company is pushing it anyway.
What demographic is it most effective on?
White men.
Show me that it's going to be fair, that it's legal, before you put it out. That's what we don't have yet.
It's going to take people coming together, striving for justice in this age of automation.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. In summary, those big life-threatening categories of AI, like we were talking about earlier, are all predicated on the assumption that automation can easily identify that a human is present. And what this film does is it, spotlights the very primal issue that facial recognition, that facial recognition technology does not identify all humans. And that's a problem. That's a problem that we got to fix. So again, thank you for your time. We'll open it up to discussion, questions in the room, reactions. Yes, please.
Earlier, you talked about facial recognition and IBM backing off of it. And the reasoning was that they were discovering that the data was biased. How is data biased? Give me some examples, maybe even specifically in that case.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So the question was, back to the IBM example, how did they know that the data was biased? So a couple of things. It depends on the situation, and it depends on the law enforcement agency. And it depends on the decisions, past historical decisions that were made. But if you're familiar with the recidivism rates, right? So it's similar analytics, similar data that's involved there in showing a historical bias in the decisions that were made about whether somebody was going to either, in the case of recidivism, commit another crime, but in the case of this facial recognition, commit a crime at all, or if somebody matched the certain characteristics of somebody that was either identified as being a criminal in a case, or matched the facial recognition of a witness of a crime, as an example, and the descriptions that they gave. And what they found was that when you put the historical decisions that were made about who the criminal was, or about what kind of crime they would be charged with, or for how long they would be incarcerated or anything else, or what the sentencing would be, that showed a historical bias in discrimination to either black or brown people. So when you take facial recognition software that says, hey, we can use your past historical data to help you understand and help make predictions, but if that past historical data was already biased toward black or brown people, what that software would do was just continue to make that same decision, that same recommendation, because right in some of those agencies it was more right, according to their historical data, to charge the black or the brown person.
What's the fix for that? How do you correct that bias? It seems like a large pool of data.
Sure.
That would be kind of difficult, though. Well, depending on
talking about law enforcement, I would guess that most of the images that the law enforcement have in their database are people that they've arrested. So that's a pool of people that are in the system.
Right, and to make that algorithm market ready or robust enough, IBM would have had to train it. And again, I have not done enough research myself to confirm this. So it's possible that they were pulling all of their data to train the algorithm before even bringing it to that agency with data that did not represent what the population was, with faces, with facial recognition that did not properly represent the population. So I think where we're going to see, so back to your original question then of, okay, how do we correct that? I think where we're going to see it is in, again, warning label type of things. We're going to see it in certain minimum requirements for data labeling standards that are better than what we have today. We're going to see it in, where there sort of is this feeling that because it's unregulated, we're just kind of rushing to get this technology out onto the marketplace, right? So I think we're going to see it more in putting some guardrails down. But again, that's just on the development side. There needs to be more training on the user side, on the subscriber side. This idea, back to Brent's point of, well, the computer's right all the time. One of the big things conversations that I get into with people too is this whole idea of, take my applicant tracking system as an example. It only made a recommendation to her, did not make the decision. This is a difficult one also, is that we kind of rely on automation, addiction, where we think, well, it's right, and it told me to do that. The applicant tracking system told me to do that. Or the facial recognition software told me that, or said, and it said that he was going to commit the crime, or that he did commit the crime, so we sort of turn off our own cognitive processes that we knew were working well before this AI was there. And I think the third thing too is, again, we have to balance that these technologies could actually root out bias. This is the double-edged sword. They could root out normal human bias if used in the right way and if, programmed the right way. But that's the big if, because it's still human beings that have to do that and have to identify what is right and rightness. Go, Brent.
Well, so, you don't have to think about explaining something. It's hard enough to make an algorithm make it work in the first place. So, it's a black box in many cases.
Yep.
So, I guess the question is, let's say you're a company, you invest in this algorithm, and it works. 90% success rate. But then, if you can't explain why it made the decision it did, why did it take a left turn into traffic? Why did it offer this financial product to this people at this price?
So where is the technology? I know DARPA was doing some explainable AI research, and because that's in order to, how do you identify it?
Yeah. Well, Brent, that's a good question, because there's a whole category also of, and you'll see it on you'll see it on the Gartner hype cycle too, that there's a whole category that is suggesting that that AI should be explainable, built upon in of itself, so we don't have to have humans explain it, but that it should be built in a way that it can be explainable. Or, you know, the other conundrum is, should we have AI root out the bias in your data before you use your data in the AI? All possibilities, right? Everything that you said, all possible. Again, if done right, and what is right, and it still has to be programmed and overseen by humans. Human agency and oversight was one of the requirements, at least on the EU Commission side of that, right? So it's like, okay, how do we figure that out, and what level can we put it at where the human agency or oversight is done in a way that you know, is helping to ensure the good and the right, and still allowing us to get the awesome technology that we know is tied up here, that we could. Go ahead. Yep.
I agree with your message, and I appreciate it, but I'm a database developer, and I struggle with trying to wrap my mind around how to accomplish some of these things. Some of the algorithms I've written are 20 to 30,000 lines in code, and almost impossible for me to figure out what they're doing when I look at it a week or 2 weeks later, especially when I get challenged to explain how it came up with the result. Mm-hmm. And so I don't disagree with what you're saying. I appreciate the message. I agree with it. I struggle with how I would even make it better.
Right.
And improve it.
That's fair. It's a fair question, and I think it's a real dilemma that I'm glad you're asking it, because it means that this is important to you, right? Step one, right, is that it bothers you. You know, what we talk about with data scientists is your awareness of it was the most important part first, that it's possible, right? And I do think that being transparent about and being able to explain it to the best that you can, and then the more that you're explaining it to other people that are not data scientists, and you get that reaction and that feedback that goes, okay, I'm starting to feel uncomfortable about it. And then we ask why, right? And we ask the 5 whys or hows, right? How did it get to that answer? How do we, are we sure that we're not introducing any bias? Are we sure that we're not amplifying it? You know, like, start with those big questions and test yourselves, right, in amongst your community. Some organizations will go as far as having like an advisory board where they will take people from diverse parts of, you know, the organization, and again, be able to just talk about where we do have some of these algorithms. But this also isn't necessarily for your everyday situations too. There are very safe places where we're writing Power BI reports and the whole deal to pull data from different sources. That's okay, right? This conversation is, and this kind of discussion is to make sure that we're looking for these really potentially very big places that we weren't looking before around fundamental human rights, bias and discrimination and safety within those algorithms. So I understand, I get it. First step is though that you're aware of it, and you know, any desire to have your colleagues aware of it is going to help.
Sir, we have a question, comment from a chat box, chat room. Using the OpenAI hide and seek example, it takes millions of training attempts for the AI to be functional, and even when they become functional, they broke the physics engine of the platform. How do you account for bias if the AI takes millions of learning cycles and even then will require human interaction? Are we rushing to find a problem to solve with a flawed tool?
That's deep. It's a great question. This is more of a discussion than it is a Q&A. You know, I don't know, anybody reacting to this too. This doesn't just have to come from me. I mean, I go back similar to the question about, you know, look, I'm a data scientist, and so I have 20,000 lines of code and the whole deal. Yeah, this is a real dilemma. It's a real, I think, situation that we have to be aware of, that it's one thing for us to say that we can assume, or we should assume, or we should be going looking for the bias, and it's another one to say it might just not be there when we analyze it. I still go back to this idea of knowing and being consciously aware that it could be, I think, is the most important thing. And checking ourselves and, you know, asking others to check our rationale and our conclusions about the fact about whether it is or it is not biased is a good place to start. Red teaming exercises, if you're familiar with red teaming exercises, have somebody else try to hack it, have somebody else try to, you know, turn it biased or discriminatory, or have somebody else try to prove that it's not. You know, there's ways in which I think we can test these things, but again, I get it. These are very complex moving parts in AI, and what we're asking to do here is bring people that are not technical to your discussions. Bring people that have very diverse backgrounds to those designs and to those conversations. And I know that's scary, because it's like, how do I explain to them what he just said about data scientists, or how do I explain what this person wrote about this question to non-technical communities? I get that. And that's part of the challenge when we talk about human rights and how it feels as human beings to have this technology used on us. We have to be able to explain it. I don't know, anybody else have a response to that? Drew? A new question? Eric?
I think overarching, at the beginning, Chuck wants me to use it. You know, at the beginning, you had that one slide up there. I think how much has been spent on it? $10 million or something like that, and it's going to be 126.
Right, 126 billion.
126 billion by 2025, whatever it is.
Right.
If that's any indication, just from a numbers perspective, we're in the midst of an evolution when it comes to this.
Right.
Right. So I totally agree with that. What just came in that Mike just read. Yeah. I think that, yeah, we're putting a lot of pressure on ourselves to make things right, yeah. And it's really it's an immature technology. Yeah. There's a lot of learning to happen. Yeah. You know, I mean, I'm sorry, what was your name? Jason. So let me ask you. So what is it that what are you being questioned? If you yourself as a human being are doing 20,000 lines of code or whatever, who's coming at you and saying, what is this? How are you, why are we getting this result? Who are those people asking you that question?
In this case, it's internal customers. So my downstream internal customers that have some skin in the game and are responsible for the solution we've put together.
The output.
Yeah.
And decisions made from it.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And some of that also has to do with just trust in general, right? Lots of times people don't like what the data told them, and so they want you to go back because it doesn't feel like it's the right answer, right?
The
We have that
truth
problem with
hurts.
ethics too. Go. Yeah, right. True.
And that's my question is, we're building these AI solutions to make decisions, and we don't want them to be biased. And yet sometimes, like you just said, the truth hurts. Is the truth, like, it depends on your perspective, though, what truth is. Correct. And how we're getting there.
Yeah.
I mean, people as a whole are usually, like, an individual person is really well-meaning, but people as a whole, my mentality is the thing, and sometimes as a collective, we suck. How do we get our code not to suck when as a collective, right, we can't do it without computer aid? And now we're trying to have computers aid us. So the part I'm trying to wrap my head around is, how do you actually build something to make a decision that is going to feel exclusionary to the people as saying, no, you're not qualified for this, or no, you don't meet the criteria. Yeah. Even if it's black and white and explainable, how do I ensure that it's not biased and is right, accurate, or vice versa?
Yeah, it's again a great conundrum question, right? And you know, the hiring algorithm people that we work with, right? One of their concerns too is that you know, they're building an algorithm to use in as many, because it's again a business model, right? To use in as many situations and applications as possible. But I'm sure we can all imagine situations where we actually may be wanting or needing to diversify in a particular gender in one role and a different gender in another role or another profile, because our diversity of gender might be skewed one way in one profession and another way in another profession. So it's how do I make sure that my algorithm product that I'm bringing as the person who's wearing the seller name tag is going to be suitable for market and good enough in high quality to allow Drew to say, in my use of it though, as the buyer or the subscriber or the user, I need it to tell me, I need it to give me my best scenarios to fit my profile of the candidates that we're looking for, right? And that's where things get tricky.
The other question that comes to mind then, because you brought up gender, is, yeah, I mean, there are certain professions that are predominantly female and right, predominant. That doesn't mean they're all, and then that, no, but there's, for whatever reason, a natural bent that people tend to go in those directions for whatever reason. Yeah. Are we asking to, at some level, code bias in to counter bias that could potentially right, create worse bias?
Right. Very good conundrum that you're pointing out. I mean, I know you're not asking me for an answer here, but
well, if you could.
I don't have this answer, right? But if I could, yes, absolutely. But no, I mean, that's, again, it comes back down to being able to explain it, mm-hmm, understand it, and, you know, all of those different roles that people are playing, defining what is right for the use, right for the application, how clean the data is when it's going in. Some organizations say, I'm afraid of my historical data, so I'm going to start fresh. I don't know if that's the answer either. You know, but again, this is part of that whole designing for ethics, designing for responsibility. And so at the time that you are contemplating bringing these technologies in, or at the time that you're contemplating developing them, having these clinical discussions and practices, the standards bodies that are going through. The EU Commission does have a very good set of yes-no questions to go through. We've turned that into a capability and maturity model so that it's a little more informative than just saying, yes, I ticked the box. Yes, I checked off that I red teamed my exercise. Yes, I checked, yeah. Okay, but what did you actually do with that? What are you going to do to improve it? So, you know, these are all seeds that I think we can continue to grow and figure out how to do it right. Anything else?
My head hurts.
Chuck? Anybody else?
Go for it.
I just wanted to say I worked in machine learning for a little while, and one of the ways that that we learned when we were there, to prevent weird bias, and it wasn't even like a DE and I or like an ethics thing really was, but it's very applicable, is not giving unnecessary information to the algorithm to begin with. And we found that like we would just throw all the data into the algorithm. People have a tendency to do that, and they think, okay, the algorithm's going to figure it out. Well, the way the algorithms are written, they'll essentialize on non-important information. And so I've read about, for instance, cases where resume screening systems, they realized, you know what, we don't need to put the applicant's name into the data because the system will essentialize on the name based on the way people select their resumes, right? There's so one great example is Silicon Valley has a much larger Asian population than they do outside of Silicon Valley. And it's sort of like a reverse discrimination thing. It's kind of strange, where they found that using the resume screening system database that they were using in Silicon Valley, outside of Silicon Valley, ended up selecting very strongly for people of Asian descent, even though there weren't as many of them in that area. It was actually selecting against people who weren't Asian. And it happens in the opposite direction as well, because they're using data sets from populations or from areas that are not reflective of another area, for instance. So they realize certain information like the name, which can reflect those kind of things, they just remove from the data. You want to remove. I think one of the terms I like to use over and over is essentializing data. If it's something the system can essentialize on, remove it. If it's really not important, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you actually reminded me of two really awesome points there. Thank you for that, because one is this idea of, I have mountains of data, so let's just use it, right? And that just is not responsible. I mean, your point is that you have to remember that the algorithm doesn't necessarily know which of this data is frivolous and or, to your point, not applicable to that decision making. So that's really important. And the second thing is, this idea that, bias in data science is different. There's a different definition for bias in data science than the social bias that we talk about. Bias in data science is, am I wrong in one direction more often than another? This was your point about the way we talk about bias. Now, socially biased, yeah, sure, you can formulate a similar definition, but doing harm to an individual population, that's what we talk about in bias and discrimination in society. So when when algorithms are quote unquote only concerned with if you're wrong in one direction, if it's not programmed right, and if you haven't put thought into that process, and or if you put too much data in that is frivolous, it can happen. And checking ourselves and asking ourselves those questions, hopefully, is how we get there.
So we do have another comment from one of the online group people. Ed mentions, I think that developers and software testers need to be educated on this topic so they can purposely design AI software that minimizes bias. Do you see that happening in some of the education pieces?
Yeah, so I think one of the slides that I had up, now these numbers are, it depends on where you get your surveys from and all that good stuff. Sorry, this is going to be painful. We're going to go back. I think it was something like 13% of data scientists are being taught right now in school. So the short answer is, depending upon where you get your survey data, we got a ways to go yet. And it's coming. There it is. 1/3 of executives are not aware. 18% of data scientist students are learning. about AI ethics. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple things we're doing. Organizations like ours and public interest technologists like myself, we're doing as much as we can to. We're working with high school students actively. There are college students. We've got badges, and so creating that awareness certainly is something that we want to do in the pipeline. There is some talk about licensure, and I don't want to scare any data scientists in the room, but there is some talk about the potential for licensure. And it's early conversation. It's sort of being dribbled out there of, should it look sort of like you can't be a CPA and you can't practice as an attorney, can't practice as a data scientist unless you've had some of this training. It may come more in the form of like professional certifications, like your IEEE standards or anybody else. So I think we're probably going to see over time that it's a little bit of a combination of all those, so a dash of this and a dash of that. Interesting, one of the top HR professional certification organizations, not SHRM, but the other one, HRCI, I believe. HR, I don't know what the C is, Institute. They've added an ethics requirement to all their certifications. They're like one of the top standards next to SHRM for HR certifications. They've added an ethics requirement. Now, not specifically AI ethics, but I'm simply pointing out that they didn't have it before. They're adding it and putting it as a requirement to all of them. And so HR professionals who have those certifications are going to be looking for more ethics awareness and ethics training. This is a great place potentially to start with them because, again, they're in the top high-risk category for AI ethics. So yeah, in short, I agree with you that this should be part of, sort of some version of core training and awareness. You don't have to wait for that to become the requirement. There are ways in which you can bring, this awareness to your organization. Contact me, happy to help. So agreed. All right, I think we'll call it a wrap. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I've ignored this entire side. I hope I gave you enough eye contact.
Go ahead. Isn't that biased?
Yeah, I did. I did just bias this whole side of the room.
So, Sarah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's one topic that I'm surprised hasn't come up, I guess, because there's this bigger question around awareness. If you think about, how many have seen the Social Dilemma? The Netflix, maybe watch it. It's like Coded Bias. It's very good.
Another film we recommend.
Somebody back here made the comment about people not being able to handle the truth.
Right.
So it's very easy to be live in an algorithmically driven bubble, let's say. So I don't even know my question. It's just that the topic that hasn't come up, obviously it's got ethics and AI and accountability all around it. So maybe just looking for some thoughts.
Yeah, so Social Dilemma is another film that we recommend. Recommend is a weird word. It's a very relevant film and documentary that definitely does cover quite heavily and extensively and in depth the social media algorithms, right, that drive our world. So it implies and it infers, and you can get a lot of really good insight from that as it pertains to AI. So you're right, the two films together are very powerful and very eye-opening. In particular, I think the line that really stuck for me the most, Brent, from that film was anytime the product is free, you are the product, right? And that goes back to my slide about, the 483 exabytes of data. The number one place we're getting that from is social media, and the number one device we're getting it from is the mobile devices, because they're in everybody's hands and everybody's on social media and all those kinds of things. So that really stood out for me, and I think really set the tone, regardless of the fact that it was really in depth on social media, but also because, these free platforms, just going back to the IBM example, the free platform of it's a common source platform. So Flickr was where those images were, and they were scraped because IBM could get easy access to that. And I don't think anybody, certainly didn't intend for that. And it was interesting because to basically recover from that, the only way you could, this is odd, right? The only way that you could opt out of it and have them to not use the image is if you sent them a picture of yourself. Because again, that was the only way they could go find where they had your image, was if they knew who you were, so they could use their AI to scour it and take it back out again. Like, right? So again, yeah, social dilemma is another good one. And it's again another good one that if you watch with younger generations as well. I know I sat my kids down and we watched both films so that they're aware. And I do believe that expectation is more and more on people's minds. I've heard high school and college students talking about ethics and AI, more than certainly I was at that time, because we just weren't talking about it then. But it's on their minds, and it's something that they're passionate about, which is, obviously good to hear for the larger, I think, society benefit. Okay, well, thank you again. Thanks to everybody for hanging with us virtually. Happy to keep the dialogue and the debates going and answer all these big questions. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Lots to talk about. Lots to think about. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Oh, yes.
No, thanks very much. No, that was great. Love it when it gets engaging, and then, all of a sudden 2 hours is just never enough, right? Thanks to everybody that joined us online. Thank you all for coming out. For those of you that are present, it's not quite over just yet. But just to let everybody know what's happening coming up in March, we have Identity as the New Perimeter. We have the VP of Cybersecurity from Kohler that's going to be coming down to join us and talk about that topic. And then in April, we have the Modern Data Center. Not sure who the speaker is or panel or whatever for that yet. Tech conference in May. Let's see. You have anything in regards to sponsorships? Anybody that I should toss out? No? Did we let everybody know we have a new platinum sponsor? Our new platinum sponsor is Nutanix. So thank you for joining us, Nutanix. I don't think anybody's here right now, but maybe online. And then do we have anybody else? Is the other one? Is Tanium? And then we just, Tanium just joined us as a gold sponsor for both Milwaukee and Madison. So those are a couple of folks that have just joined us recently. So thank you very much. Without you, we wouldn't be here. And then, of course, for any of you that would like to join us as members, we're always open. And with that, go out this door, hang a right. There's a reception for anybody that's here. We have open bar, food from the chef. It's going to be fantastic. Thank you again to everybody online. Thank you, everybody here. Thank you, Sarah. Break. Let's go. We're out.